So after over 300 episodes of the podcast, you'd think we've covered it all, right? Every subject, boxed. There is nothing left. Well, far from it. We've got loads to go. And today is a prime example of that. Because we're going to introduce to you an important calculation that we've never talked about before.
Thank you for joining us once again for episode 331 of the Property Podcast, where every Thursday morning property investors come to be informed and inspired. This week, we're talking about one of our favourite subjects. No, not ourselves for once, but money and how much money you're going to make out of property. So stick around for that and make sure you stick around all the way to the end for Hub Extra, where we've got a tool that's going to make your internet browsing life that little bit more pleasant.
So in our news story this week, we're looking at the latest figures from HomeTrack, and every month they put out a home price index. And the report we're looking at is for May 2019. Obviously, there's a little bit of a lag with the data, which is understandable. But regardless of that, it's really, really interesting. So, Rob, I'm sure we could be accused of using news stories that highlight that we've been correct about things, and they'd be absolutely right. And that's why we are bringing you, or at least one of the reasons we are bringing you this news story. Of course, we've used this report before, and it's really important to keep on track of areas that are doing well and also areas that are not. So when we're looking at cities for capital growth, top of the chart is Liverpool, followed by Belfast, Nottingham, Leicester, Manchester, Edinburgh, and Birmingham. And if we look at cities in England, ones that we've picked out as places to watch this year, we have 4 of the top 5. So we're pretty pleased with ourselves. People won't be that pleased though, Rob, if they've been investing in Aberdeen, London or Oxford. And that'll be the case for any time over the last few years now, because they've not been having a good time.
Yeah, luckily no one can hold us responsible for that. But yeah, prices are actually down year on year in those 3 cities. It just goes to show the importance of picking your areas, because the difference is huge. Aberdeen, the worst, minus 4.2. Liverpool, the best, plus 5. So a really big spread there. When they put out this research, there's always the city by city league, but there's some analysis around it as well that's often quite interesting. And a piece of analysis this month is looking at the areas that are most affordable as a first-time buyer. And no surprise, the places that are least affordable for a first-time buyer, London, Cambridge and Oxford. What I found interesting is that the best affordability for a first-time buyer in the UK is in Liverpool. And that to me is a strong indicator that that growth that Liverpool is currently enjoying is set to continue, because it's got the furthest to grow. Even though it's a current hotspot, even though it's got so much more going for it, it is still the most affordable place for a first-time buyer to buy anywhere. So that can give you some confidence that the reason Liverpool's doing well isn't just random, it's not just having a good year, it's because it is underpriced relative to other locations, therefore has got further to grow.
Yeah, and the same applies for Sheffield and Nottingham, 2 other areas that we've tipped, and they are right up there as well at the top of affordability charts. So when areas with great fundamentals are affordable, the next thing that comes is capital growth. So we've talked about those areas for a while, and absolutely we know a lot of you are focusing in on Liverpool now, but don't rule out Sheffield and Nottingham. There's big things to come for those places too. Quick heads up, we've got a new YouTube video out. We try and get one out every week. We're not quite there yet, but we're not far away. And this week we've got a great video for you. It's about using a limited company as a buy-to-let investor. Should you be using one or not? Well, this video will help you out. Search for Property Hub UK, find our channel, watch that video, and while you're there, subscribe so you don't miss any more. And there's a little bell you can click to be notified every time a new video comes out. Just like the podcast, no fluff, no adverts, just loads of education. So take advantage of that one too.
This week, we're getting back to basics and talking about something that most people consider pretty important when it comes to property investment, and that is making money from it. And more specifically, the different ways in which you can make money from it. There's a debate that we've had many times in the past about what you optimize for. Do you optimize for the rental income that you're going to get or potential capital growth? And we've talked at length about the balance between the two. But what's been implicit in those conversations is what you really care about, the total return that you're going to make from the property over time. And this week, we're going to take what's been implicit and make it explicit. We're going to talk about the total return you can make from a property investment, how to calculate it, and most importantly, why it matters.
So we're going to talk about 2 key components. And then at the end, we're going to present something to you that we've not talked about before on the podcast. But before we get there, Let's start with the first component, which is rental return. So rental return is really important for a few reasons. One, it's, as Rob said, it's about making money. How much will you earn while you own that property? If you don't make any money while owning your investment, well, it's not an investment, it's a liability. So a rental return is critical. Now, for some people, it is so important to them that it defines their strategy. The amount they make through their rental return will determine whether they are being successful or not as an investor. For others, it's just important that it's profitable. Now, you can look at rental return in a few different ways. You can look at the gross yield, the net yield, but our preferred way to assess any deal is the ROI, your return on investment. Now, your return on investment is a relatively simple calculation. What you do is you tally up how much money you need to put into the deal. So that will include stamp duty, solicitor's fees, mortgage broker fees, and of course, your deposit. Get that number, add it all together, and then look at your income after all costs. So your rental income minus any mortgage repayments, if it's an apartment, any service charges, and so on. You get the idea. Then what you do, you take that return and divide it by the amount you're putting into that investment, and that will give you your ROI. So, for example, if you make £10,000 each year as net income, and you had to put £100,000 into the deal to purchase that property, then your ROI, your return on investment, will be 10%. Now, a word of warning. Everyone's version of ROI is different, and people will ask, what's the ideal ROI? Well, it will depend. It will depend on what costs you include. And there's no limit to what you include or exclude. It's going to depend on you and what's important to you. What's most important is you're consistent with your calculations. So if you include void periods, for example, which not everybody does, but if you do include void periods as one of your costs on your cash flow, then do that on every cash flow. Don't be selective of what you include and don't include on different calculations. Otherwise, it's going to throw your numbers out.
Now, rental return, of course, is important because you want your property to be putting money in your pocket. Even if you're not spending it, it's something you can roll up into future deals. And of course, you want to have some nice breathing space in there to make sure that you can always cover the costs associated with the property. The nice thing about your rental return is it's relatively steady over time. Whatever it is when you buy the property is going to be similar in every following year because your costs are going to be similar and your income is going to be similar as well. Rents don't jump up and down all over the place like capital values do, and your expenses, as long as you've made sensible allowances and you're not buying a property that's going to potentially have loads of unexpected things needing to be done to it, is going to be fairly consistent as well. The rental return that you can expect is going to vary massively between different types of property in different locations. You can see rental returns of 10% or more, which obviously, compared to the other investments that you'd expect to make, looks very attractive. But you could also see rental returns as low as 2%. And on the face of it, you might think, well, why would I go to all the effort of owning a property if I'm just going to get a couple of percent rental return? I could pretty much get that in the bank. But the reason you might do that is because of the second component of return in property, and that is capital return.
So in property investment, most people talk about rental return, but capital return for most investors is actually the most important number because it's where the wealth is created. The difference between a 5% and a 6% rental return may be a few quid, nothing life-changing. But the difference of a percentage difference in capital growth is a big number. And of course, this is magnified by leverage. So 5% capital growth, for example, if you're leveraging at 50%, would actually give you 10% capital return. And most of us leverage at a higher number. Now, of course, a capital return is not guaranteed and it can go against you. But if you're a long-time listener to the Property Podcast, you'll know that property over the long term does go up in value. So if you're in it for the long term, then your capital returns or your capital growth can be a real game changer when it comes to your wealth creation.
And the other thing that you'll know if you're a long-time listener, or even if you've just observed the property market for a while, is that capital returns are not the same every year. They can vary enormously. There'll be times when the value of your property is going up sharply. There'll be times when it's going down sharply, and there'll be others where it stays more or less the same. In any given year, your capital return could be anything from minus figures to 20% or more. Unlike rental return, your capital return is going to be all over the place if you're just looking at a 1-year period. But that's why we talk about property as a long-term investment. Your capital return in any particular year doesn't really matter. What matters is where it gets to by the time you sell the property. And that is what will allow us to calculate what we really care about, which is your total return from the property.
Now, there's a lot of debate around which is best. Should you be focusing on rental return or should you be focusing on capital growth? What's the best? Well, it's going to be different for every single person. It's going to be determined by what is your strategy. If your approach to property is more on a short-term time frame and that you need to get out of your job or retire quite quickly, then rental return is more likely going to be the avenue you pursue. If, however, you are in this for the long term, the number that can make more difference to your life is capital return. And while that is a simplistic way to assess things, you can take this up a notch further and look at a calculation that we've not talked about before on the podcast, which is total return.
So the total return that you'll make from owning a property is each year's rental return added together plus your final capital return. So let's give an example of that. Let's say that you buy a house for £100,000 completely using cash, just to keep it simple. Let's also say that every year you make a 5% rental return. Now, in reality, it's never going to be that exact, even though rental return is not going to vary massively. It will be slightly higher some years and slightly lower on others, depending on your expenses. But for the sake of a simple example, let's just say that every single year it's 5%. You own that property for 10 years, and then at the end of the 10 years, because of inflation and capital growth, it's worth £150,000. So it's gone up by £50,000 in the time that you've owned it. So how do you calculate your total return from that? Well, your rental return will be 10 times that 5% return that you've made each year because you've owned it for 10 years. In our case, it's a 5% return on £100,000. So that's £5,000 times 10 years, meaning you've made £50,000 in rental profit over your ownership period. Pretty good. Then there's the capital return. As we know, the property when we sell it is worth £150,000. When we bought it, it was worth £100,000. So over that period, we've made a capital return of £50,000. Now that doesn't say anything about the returns that we've made in each year of that period. There might be some years where it's actually been negative, but it doesn't matter. What matters is what it's worth at the end of the period when we sell. So then to work out total return, we just add those two things together. So the rental return is £50,000. The capital return is £50,000. So we made a total return of £100,000, which is 100% of our initial investment because we put in £100,000 at the beginning. We've made a profit in total of £100,000. So that's 100% total return on our initial investment.
So while you may be focused on one of the two strategies, or predominantly that is your focus, by looking at your total return, it's a great way of assessing how your investments are stacking up, particularly as you build a portfolio. You may identify an area that, because of its total return, is far more profitable for you. So looking at your total return, at least on an annual basis when you review your portfolio, is a really powerful tool, and it's a calculation that you should bring into the mix, at the very least when you review your portfolio, but you can also use it when potentially assessing a deal as well. But of course, though, you'll be making some assumptions. So why does this matter? It's great that if you understand which of these is right for you. And if you didn't before this podcast, then you'll have a better idea now. But it's important to note that they are all important. Even if rental income is your predominant focus, you should still keep an eye on the capital return. And you can use that total return calculation to work it out. But equally, if your focus is capital return, you still need an income. And you still should be looking at what your property is bringing in year on year. Remember, if it doesn't make money, if it doesn't pay the bills and give you a little bit on top, then it is not an asset. So rental return is there to pay the bills and give you an income, if that's what you care about. And capital growth is the biggest source of wealth over the long term. But Rob, it's important to look at both components. If you over-optimize for one, it can actually become inefficient for you as a property investor.
Definitely. So if you optimize completely for the amount of rent that you're collecting in a given year, then chances are you're going to sacrifice capital return and therefore impede your total return. That's because the way it works tends to be that the highest yielding investments are in the areas that have got low growth prospects. As you've already hinted at, that might be okay. If having the certainty of that money coming in is what matters to you and you don't particularly care that over a long period of time you'll make less, then that's okay. But we'll often see people really trying to optimize totally for rental return because that's the part you can see, it's the part you can rely on, that kind of makes sense. But by doing so, they actually make it less likely that they'll achieve their long-term goal, which might be retirement in 20 years or something like that. Something else that you see less often, but you do see, is people who are optimizing totally for capital growth. So an example of this might be buying a high-end property in London, which actually costs you money to own. You have to keep on chucking money in every month to pay the bills because the rent just doesn't cover it. So you're making a negative rental return, but you're doing it because you think that the capital return over time will make it worthwhile. That's something you don't see so much of now. We saw a lot of it before the last crash, and it's a dangerous game to play. So the way to approach it is to find the right point on that spectrum. So the way to think about this is to put a floor on what an acceptable rental return is for you. If you need or you want a high rental return because having that cash coming in is really important to you, then you'll have a pretty high floor and that's okay. If it's not important to you, if you just want the property to be able to cover its costs and make a little bit extra to roll up into future purchases, then the floor will be low and that's fine too. You set your acceptable rental return. Then within those parameters, you can look for the best capital return you can get. So if you've got two properties that are delivering the same rental return, but one has the potential for much higher growth than the other, then clearly that's the investment you should be going for. Of course, it's all guesswork. You can never be sure, but we've given plenty of pointers in the past about things to look out for to see where the growth is likely to be highest.
So there you have it, a new calculation, but it's a simple one and it's one that you should be aware of. And you should also be aware if you're chasing the extremes of either rental return or capital growth. It's great to know what you want, but extreme versions of both can end up actually costing you money. So it's time for a listener success story, and this is coming through our Instagram channel. You can find us on Instagram at Property Hub UK. You'll find us on all the social channels using that handle. And Jocelyn has left this lovely message. I've read 2 of your books, subscribed to the magazine, and have accessed your online courses. All are excellent. I'm a total newbie and in the process of buying my first 2 buy-to-lets. But I have plans going forward to develop a whole portfolio. I'm fascinated by property investment, and so far I'm pretty hooked. Well done. Not 1, but 2 buy-to-lets in the pipeline. That is incredible. Congratulations to you. And for those who are wondering, those online courses that you refer to are free. You can find them on the Property Hub website. Check out the free education section where you'll find all the podcasts, all our articles, and all our courses.
Time now for Hub Extra, where we give you that extra tip, quote, tool, whatever it is, to make your life that little bit better. And we give you even more in the Hub Extra email that you'll receive every Friday morning. If you've been listening to the podcast for a while, you'll know that we love our Chrome extensions and we also love reading. And this week's Hub Extra resource combines both of those. It's a Chrome extension called Just Read. And what it does basically is strip all the rubbish out of a web page so you can read it properly. Now, this is something you will not need to do on the Property Hub website because there are no adverts and we've designed it specifically for readability. But if you go onto most websites, especially any newsy kind of websites, there's so much rubbish. There are adverts at the side, there are adverts in the middle, there's things popping up at you, there's noise everywhere. And with this extension, all you have to do is click a button and it all goes away, and it's just beautifully clear and easy to read. So if you do a lot of reading online, and I'm sure most of us do, this extension will just make that experience that little bit more pleasant.
So it's time for us to walk away. But talking of walking away, make sure you join us next week because the podcast is about walking away from deals. Yes, we talk about how you should be motivating yourself to push forward, but actually there's lots of reasons to walk away from a deal. And next week we give you those reasons. But we're going to give you another reason to come back to the podcast because on Tuesday we have Ask Rob and Rob. So make sure you don't miss that. But until those wonderful events occur, take care, have fun. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.